July 22, 2002. Summer heat hung over Gaza City's Al-Daraj neighborhood as families settled into sleep, their windows open to catch whatever breeze might offer relief from the oppressive humidity. In a three-story apartment building on a narrow street crowded with similar structures, Salah Shehadeh prepared for bed alongside his wife Layla and their 15-year-old daughter Iman. At approximately 50 years old, Shehadeh had co-founded Hamas 15 years earlier, survived at least 7 Israeli assassination attempts, and commanded the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, the organization's military wing responsible for dozens of suicide bombings that had killed more than 100 Israelis in the preceding 18 months. He believed that living among civilians in a densely populated residential neighborhood provided protection, that Israel would not risk the diplomatic consequences of striking a target surrounded by innocent families. He was wrong. Within minutes, an Israeli F-16 would release a 1-ton bomb that would obliterate his apartment and 7 adjacent structures, and 15 people would be dead, including Shehadeh, his wife, his daughter, and 7 children from neighboring families who had gone to sleep believing themselves safe in their own homes. The Al-Daraj neighborhood sprawled across the eastern quarter of Gaza City like a dense labyrinth where narrow streets twisted between apartment buildings constructed so close together that neighbors could pass items between windows, where laundry lines stretched overhead, creating canopies of drying clothes, where children played football in alleyways barely wide enough for a single car to pass. By the summer of 2002, this densely populated residential district had become typical of Gaza's urban landscape, housing thousands of families in multi-story concrete structures built during decades of population growth that had transformed the territory into one of the most densely populated places on Earth. The Second Intifada, the Palestinian uprising that had erupted in September 2000 following the collapse of peace negotiations, had brought violent conflict to these streets with increasing frequency. Israeli aircraft struck targets throughout Gaza with growing regularity, while Hamas and Islamic Jihad launched rockets toward Israeli towns and dispatched suicide bombers into Israeli cities, cafes, buses, and public spaces. By July 2002, more than 700 Israelis had been killed in attacks that included the Passover massacre at a hotel in Netanya, 30 dead in March 2002, the Dolphinarium discotheque bombing in Tel Aviv, 21 dead in June 2001, and dozens of smaller operations that had transformed daily life in Israel into a calculus of risk. Hamas commanders operated from within neighborhoods like Al-Daraj precisely because the civilian density provided cover, because Israeli intelligence struggled to track individuals who moved through these crowded streets, and because the presence of families and children created operational complications that sometimes deterred strikes. The strategy had proven effective for years, protecting senior operatives who lived and worked among the population they claimed to represent. Salah Shehadeh was born around 1952 in Beit Hanun, a town in the northern Gaza Strip that had been a center of Palestinian resistance since before the establishment of Israel. He had joined the Muslim Brotherhood during studies in Egypt, where he absorbed the ideology of Islamic resistance that would shape his career, and by the time he returned to Gaza in the early 1980s, he had established himself within networks of activists who were preparing for more organized confrontation with Israeli occupation. In December 1987, when spontaneous riots erupted across the occupied territories and crystallized into what became known as the First Intifada, Shehadeh was among the small group of men who met in Gaza City to establish Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood's armed response to the uprising. He rose quickly through the organization's hierarchy, proving himself capable of building clandestine networks, recruiting operatives, and maintaining operational security despite Israeli intelligence efforts to penetrate the group. By 2002, Following the assassination of his predecessor in an Israeli airstrike, Shehadeh had assumed command of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, making him the most senior military official in Hamas and placing him at the center of the organization's most lethal operations. His operational record was extensive and devastating. Israeli intelligence assessments credited him with directing or authorizing attacks that had killed more than 100 Israelis in the 18 months preceding July 2002, a period of escalating violence that had transformed the Second Intifada from stone-throwing protests into sustained campaigns of suicide bombing. The Passover massacre at the Park Hotel in Netanya, where a bomber had killed 30 people during a Seder dinner, had been planned and authorized by commanders under Shehadeh's supervision. The Dolphinarium discotheque attack in Tel Aviv, which killed 21 teenagers waiting outside a nightclub, bore the operational signatures of tactics he had developed. Attacks on buses, cafes, shopping centers, and checkpoints throughout Israel were coordinated through networks he had built over 15 years of clandestine work. He had pioneered the use of female suicide bombers, expanded Hamas's rocket manufacturing capabilities, and established smuggling routes through the Egyptian border that provided weapons and explosives to sustain operations. Israeli analysts believed he was planning even larger attacks, including the use of massive car bombs containing up to 500 kilograms of explosives that could devastate entire city blocks. Shehadeh had survived at least 7 assassination attempts through a combination of operational security measures that included constantly changing locations, using body doubles, avoiding communication patterns that could be intercepted, and maintaining the protective cover of civilian populations. He had been wounded multiple times, according to intelligence reports, and had lost associates and family members to Israeli strikes. By the summer of 2002, he was living in the Al-Daraj apartment with his wife Layla and their daughter Iman, among other family members, maintaining the appearance of ordinary civilian life while directing operations that made him Israel's most wanted man in Gaza. The decision to kill Salah Shehadeh, despite the near certainty of civilian casualties, was made at the highest levels of Israeli government following weeks of intelligence gathering and operational planning that involved the military, Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, and senior political leadership. Prime Minister Ariel Sharon had been receiving briefings on Shehadeh's activities since taking office in early 2001, and by the summer of 2002, those briefings emphasized both the immediate threat the Hamas commander posed and the limited window of opportunity to eliminate him. Defense Minister Benjamin Ben Eliezer, a former general who understood the military implications of urban strikes, participated in discussions about operational alternatives and their probable outcomes. Chief of Staff Moshe Ya'alon and Israel Air Force Commander Dan Halutz provided technical assessments of what would be required to ensure Shehadeh's death, given the construction of the target building and the likelihood that he would be surrounded by family members and neighbors. Shin Bet surveillance had confirmed Shehadeh's location in the Al-Daraj apartment through multiple intelligence sources, including human assets who reported his movements and electronic intercepts that placed him at the address with sufficient confidence to authorize a strike. The intelligence also indicated that his wife would likely be present, and that the apartment building housed multiple families in adjacent units, but assessments of exactly how many civilians might be in the immediate blast radius remained incomplete. Planners considered alternatives to an aerial strike, including a ground operation using special forces to enter the building and capture or kill Shehadeh with minimal civilian harm, but military advisors concluded that such an approach carried unacceptable risk of operational failure and casualties among Israeli soldiers. The element of surprise would be difficult to maintain in a densely populated neighborhood where Shehadeh's supporters could provide warning or armed resistance, and the tactical advantage of air power was deemed necessary to guarantee success. The selection of a 1-ton Mark 84 bomb was deliberate and controversial, even within the planning process. Smaller munitions would reduce the blast radius and lower the probability of civilian casualties, but they also increased the chance that Shehadeh might survive if he happened to be in a reinforced section of the building or if the bomb's trajectory was slightly off target. The 1-ton bomb would ensure complete destruction of the apartment and everyone inside, eliminating any possibility of survival, but guaranteeing extensive collateral damage to adjacent structures. IDF legal advisors reviewed the planned operation under the framework of proportionality required by international humanitarian law, weighing the military value of eliminating a commander responsible for killing more than 100 Israeli civilians against the anticipated deaths of Palestinian civilians who happened to live near the target. The legal opinion concluded that the strike was permissible, though it acknowledged that civilian casualties would likely occur. On July 22, 2002, Sharon granted final authorization for the operation to proceed that evening. An Israeli Air Force base in southern Israel received the operational order during the afternoon of July 22nd, and by early evening, ground crews were preparing an F-16 fighter for a mission that would be described in flight logs only by coordinate numbers and a classified designation. The pilot selected for the strike was a career officer with extensive combat experience who had flown dozens of missions over Lebanon and the occupied territories, conducting reconnaissance flights, providing air support for ground operations, and executing previous targeted killing operations that had become routine elements of Israel's counterterrorism campaign. His identity would remain classified for years, protected by military secrecy protocols that shielded combat pilots from potential legal or physical reprisals, and his understanding of what awaited below the target coordinates was limited to the intelligence package he received during his pre-flight briefing. That briefing, conducted by a weapons officer who had coordinated with Shin Bet and IDF intelligence analysts, provided aerial photographs of the target building, its precise GPS coordinates, and confirmation that a high-value Hamas commander would be present at the designated strike time. The pilot was informed that the target was located in a residential neighborhood and that the operation required a 1-ton Mark 84 bomb to ensure destruction of the reinforced concrete structure. According to testimony that would emerge years later during investigations into the operation, the briefing did not emphasize the density of the surrounding population or specify how many civilians might be killed in adjacent buildings, focusing instead on the military necessity of eliminating a commander responsible for attacks that had killed numerous Israeli civilians. The pilot, following the chain of command that extended from his squadron leader through the base commander to Air Force Chief Dan Halutz, and ultimately to the defense minister and prime minister, accepted the mission as he had accepted previous assignments, trusting that political and legal authorities had made appropriate assessments of proportionality and compliance with the laws of armed conflict. The F-16 was armed with the Mark 84 bomb, a standard American-manufactured munition weighing approximately 2,000 pounds that Israeli forces had used in previous strikes throughout the occupied territories. Ground crews loaded the weapon, programmed flight computers with the target coordinates, and conducted pre-flight checks while the pilot reviewed his approach path, the timing window for weapon release, and procedures for aborting the mission if circumstances changed. Communication protocols were established with ground controllers who would provide real-time confirmation that the target remained in place, and backup procedures were outlined in case the strike needed to be rescheduled. The entire preparation process followed standard operating procedures that the Israeli Air Force had refined through thousands of missions conducted since the beginning of the Second Intifada, treating this operation as one among many in an ongoing campaign of targeted killings that had eliminated dozens of Palestinian militants over the preceding 2 years. At approximately 10:30 in the evening, the F-16 lifted off from the airbase and turned toward Gaza, carrying a bomb that would kill 15 people in less than 30 seconds from the moment of its release. In the apartment building, families were settling into sleep. The Matar family occupied a unit adjacent to Shehadeh's, 7 people including several children whose ages ranged from infancy to adolescence. Other families lived in the floors above and below in buildings that pressed against the target structure on 3 sides, forming the dense urban matrix that characterized Al-Daraj. Windows remained open despite the late hour, allowing whatever breeze might penetrate the narrow streets to provide relief from heat that lingered even after sunset. In Shehadeh's apartment, Layla and Iman were preparing for bed, while Shehadeh himself moved between rooms, his routine indistinguishable from that of any other resident in the neighborhood. A bodyguard assigned to provide security maintained position somewhere in the building, though his exact location would never be definitively established. No one in the surrounding apartments knew that the man living among them was Israel's most wanted target in Gaza, or that this anonymity was about to be shattered. At 11:27 p.m., ground controllers transmitted final confirmation to the F-16 pilot that the target remained in place and authorization to strike remained in effect. The aircraft was approximately 3 minutes from weapon release point, approaching from the south at an altitude that placed it beyond the range of small arms fire, but well within the operational envelope for precision bombing. The pilot initiated his attack run, systems confirming target lock as the aircraft's computers aligned the bomb's trajectory. With the coordinates programmed hours earlier, Gaza City spread below, its scattered lights marking neighborhoods where hundreds of thousands of people lived in structures that appeared from altitude as an undifferentiated grid of concrete and asphalt. At 11:30 p.m., the pilot released the Mark 84 bomb. The weapon fell through darkness, its 2,000 pounds of high explosive encased in metal housing designed to penetrate hardened targets before detonation. Flight time from release to impact was approximately 8 seconds, during which the families in the target building continued their evening routines, unaware that their lives were being measured in fractions of seconds. The bomb struck the target building at its center, penetrating through the roof and upper floors before the fuse triggered detonation inside the structure. The explosion was massive and instantaneous, converting the building's interior into an expanding sphere of superheated gas and debris that radiated outward faster than human perception could register. Walls collapsed inward and then blew outward as pressure waves propagated through concrete and steel, shattering the structural integrity of the 3-story building and sending fragments in all directions. Shehadeh died instantly, as did his wife Layla and daughter Iman. The bodyguard was killed in the same moment. The Matar family in the adjacent apartment was obliterated, 7 people ceasing to exist in the fraction of a second between the bomb's detonation and the collapse of their home. Families in buildings immediately surrounding the target were struck by blast waves that shattered windows, collapsed walls, and sent concrete fragments tearing through rooms where children had been sleeping. The explosion was heard across Gaza City, a deep concussive boom that echoed off buildings and sent vibrations through the ground, followed by the cascading crashes of collapsing structures and the secondary sounds of debris falling into streets. Within 30 seconds, 8 buildings had been completely or partially destroyed. The target structure no longer existed as a recognizable building, reduced to a crater filled with pulverized concrete, twisted metal reinforcement bars, and the compressed remains of furniture, personal belongings, and human bodies. Adjacent structures showed varying degrees of damage, some missing entire walls, while others remained partially standing with interiors exposed like dollhouses opened for viewing. A cloud of dust rose into the night air, illuminated by fires that had ignited in the wreckage and by emergency lights that activated automatically in surrounding buildings. The blast radius extended far enough to shatter windows and damage walls and structures housing families who had no connection to Shehadeh or Hamas, who simply had the misfortune of living within 200 meters of Israel's target. Palestinian ambulances began arriving within minutes, their crews navigating streets choked with debris and panicked residents who had fled their homes believing another strike might follow. Civil defense workers began the process of searching through rubble for survivors, calling out to anyone who might be trapped beneath collapsed concrete, listening for responses that would indicate where to dig. Bodies were recovered throughout the night and into the early morning hours, some intact enough for immediate identification, others requiring forensic examination or identification by family members who survived. The initial casualty reports were chaotic and contradictory, with different sources providing different numbers as the scale of the devastation became apparent. By dawn, the full scope was emerging. 15 people were confirmed dead, though some sources would later report 17. Among the dead were at least 7 children, their ages ranging from infancy to 15. More than 50 people had been wounded, some critically, with injuries ranging from blast trauma to crush injuries from falling debris. The 8 buildings that had been completely destroyed represented homes for dozens of families, while the 9 partially destroyed structures and 20 damaged buildings displaced hundreds more residents who could no longer safely occupy their apartments. Israeli officials learned of the strike's success within minutes of the explosion, receiving confirmation from the pilot that the bomb had struck the target building and from ground intelligence sources who reported massive destruction in the Al-Daraj neighborhood. The confirmation that Shehadeh was dead arrived within hours, as intelligence analysts processed initial reports from Gaza and concluded that the Hamas commander could not have survived the direct hit. What took longer to emerge was the civilian casualty count, which grew throughout the night as bodies were recovered and hospitals reported the wounded arriving in waves. By morning, when Prime Minister Sharon and his senior advisors convened to assess the operation's outcome, they faced a reality that differed significantly from the pre-strike estimates that had anticipated some civilian harm but not carnage on the scale that had actually occurred. Sharon's initial response, delivered to reporters later that day, characterized the operation as one of Israel's most successful actions against Hamas leadership. The Prime Minister emphasized Shehadeh's responsibility for attacks that had killed numerous Israeli civilians and argued that his elimination would degrade Hamas's operational capabilities and potentially save Israeli lives by preventing future attacks the commander had been planning. Defense Minister Ben Eliezer offered a different defense, claiming that Israeli intelligence had indicated no civilians were present in the building at the time of the strike, a statement that would later be contradicted by evidence that planners knew Shehadeh's wife was with him and that adjacent structures housed families. The disconnect between these explanations and the emerging casualty reports created immediate political complications for the government, particularly as international media began broadcasting images of destroyed apartment buildings and interviewing survivors who described hearing children screaming beneath rubble. Dan Holitz, the Air Force commander who had overseen the operation's execution, gave an interview to Haaretz newspaper in late August that would become infamous for its detachment from the human consequences of the strike. When asked what a pilot feels when releasing a bomb, Holitz responded that he felt a slight bump as the aircraft lightened. When pressed about the civilian casualties, he defended the operation as professionally executed and told his pilots they could sleep well at night, that they had performed their duties correctly, and that responsibility for target selection lay with intelligence and political authorities, not with the aircrew who had simply followed orders. The interview crystallized competing perspectives on the operation, with some Israelis praising Halitz's focus on military professionalism, while critics accused him of callous indifference to the deaths of 7 children and other civilians. Palestinian Authority officials condemned the strike as a war crime and called for international investigations, though their statements carried limited weight given the organization's diminished credibility during the Second Intifada. Human rights organizations including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and Israeli groups such as Gush Shalom demanded accountability for what they characterized as a clear violation of proportionality requirements under international humanitarian law. The United Nations, European Union, and various national governments issued statements ranging from expressions of concern to outright condemnation, though none translated into concrete consequences for Israel. Within weeks of the strike, pressure from international organizations and Israeli civil society groups forced the government to establish an internal military inquiry to examine what had occurred and whether proper procedures had been followed. Defense Minister Ben Eliezer received the inquiry's findings on August 2, 2002, a document that would set the tone for how Israel would address accountability questions for years to come. The inquiry concluded that the procedures and operational assessments followed in planning the strike were correct and professional, that the elimination of Shehadeh constituted a legitimate military objective given his role in directing attacks against Israeli civilians, and that the operation had successfully removed a major terrorist leader from the battlefield. However, the inquiry acknowledged shortcomings in the intelligence available regarding the presence of civilians in structures adjacent to Shehadeh's apartment, particularly a garage and several huts where members of the Matar family had been sleeping when the bomb detonated. The report criticized decision-makers for placing too much weight on the immediate opportunity to strike Shehadeh and insufficient weight on the risks to uninvolved civilians. But it stopped short of recommending criminal investigations or disciplinary actions against any officials involved. That conclusion satisfied neither international critics nor Israeli activists who believed the operation constituted a war crime. In 2008, following a high court appeal by Yesh Gavul, an Israeli conscientious objector movement, Prime Minister Ehud Olmert appointed a special investigatory commission to conduct a more thorough examination of the strike and determine whether criminal proceedings should be initiated against those responsible. The commission worked for nearly 3 years, reviewing classified intelligence documents, interviewing officials who had participated in the planning and execution, and analyzing the legal framework under which the operation had been authorized. Its findings, submitted to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in February 2011, largely echoed the 2002 inquiry while providing greater detail about what had gone wrong. The commission determined that intelligence about civilian presence in adjacent structures had been incomplete, unfocused, and inconsistent, that analysts had failed to properly assess the likelihood of extensive collateral damage, and that the urgency placed on striking Shehadeh had overridden more careful consideration of civilian protection obligations. Despite these failures, the Commission concluded that no grounds existed for criminal prosecution of military or political officials, arguing that the operation fell within the boundaries of lawful combat operations, even if its execution had been flawed. International attempts at accountability proceeded along a separate track. In January 2009, Judge Fernando Andreu Morales of Spain's national audience opened a criminal investigation under universal jurisdiction statutes, naming 7 Israeli officials, including former Defense Minister Shaul Mofaz, former Chief of Staff Moshe Ya'alon, Benjamin Ben Eliezer, Dan Halitz, and others as potential defendants in a war crimes case. The investigation claimed jurisdiction based on the principle that certain crimes are so serious that any nation may prosecute them regardless of where they occurred. Israeli officials refused to cooperate with the Spanish proceedings, and by April 2010, appeals courts in Spain had rejected the lower court's decision, ruling that Spanish jurisdiction did not extend to the case and effectively closing the investigation without any charges being filed. The Shehadeh operation established precedents that would shape Israeli targeted killing policies for decades, demonstrating both the tactical effectiveness and the diplomatic sustainability of strikes that produced significant civilian casualties in pursuit of high-value targets. In the years following the 2002 strike, Israeli forces conducted dozens of similar operations throughout Gaza and the West Bank, eliminating Hamas commanders, Islamic Jihad leaders, and other militants using aerial strikes, missile attacks from drones, and occasionally ground operations when circumstances permitted. The methods refined after Shehadeh's killing included improved intelligence gathering on civilian presence in target areas, better coordination between surveillance assets and strike aircraft to minimize the time between target confirmation and weapon release, and more sophisticated modeling of blast effects to predict collateral damage with greater accuracy. However, the fundamental calculus remained unchanged. When Israeli decision-makers assessed a target as sufficiently valuable and sufficiently dangerous, civilian casualties were treated as regrettable but acceptable consequences of military necessity. The legal framework established through the internal inquiries and international proceedings became a template for how Israel would respond to future controversies over targeted killings. Operations would be defended as legitimate acts of self-defense against combatants actively engaged in hostilities. Civilian deaths would be attributed to intelligence failures or the enemy's practice of hiding among non-combatants. And investigations would be conducted internally rather than by international bodies, with findings that typically concluded procedures were followed correctly, even when outcomes were tragic. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times as human rights organizations documented a consistent record of Israeli strikes in Gaza that killed militant targets along with family members, neighbors, and bystanders who happened to be in proximity when bombs fell or missiles struck. The most direct parallel to the Shehadeh operation occurred 12 years later when Israeli forces attempted to kill Mohammed Deif, who had succeeded Shehadeh as commander of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades and had survived multiple previous assassination attempts over 2 decades. On July 13, 2014, during the conflict known as Operation Protective Edge, an Israeli airstrike targeted a compound in Khan Yunis, where intelligence indicated Deif was meeting with other Hamas commanders. The strike used munitions comparable to those employed against Shehadeh, dropped on an area Israel had designated as a safe zone for civilians who had evacuated from other parts of Gaza. The attack killed 90 people, according to Gaza Health Ministry figures, including women and children, though Israel claimed the toll included numerous militants. Deif survived the strike, as he had survived previous attempts, though his wife and infant daughter were killed. The operation generated international criticism similar to that which had followed the Shehadeh killing, and Israeli responses followed the same pattern of defending the strike's legitimacy while expressing regret for civilian casualties. Israeli authorities would later confirm, in August 2024, that Deif had eventually been killed in a subsequent operation, validating the persistent pursuit of targets across decades despite repeated failures and mounting civilian costs. Hamas adapted its security protocols in response to the Shehadeh precedent and subsequent operations, with senior commanders avoiding fixed locations, limiting their time in residential areas, using multiple decoys, and compartmentalizing communications to make tracking more difficult. These adaptations forced Israeli intelligence to invest greater resources in surveillance and develop more sophisticated methods for confirming target locations, but they did not fundamentally alter the vulnerability of Hamas leaders to aerial strikes. The organization rebuilt its military capabilities despite the loss of Shehadeh and other senior figures, promoting new commanders who continued operations using the same tactics and strategies their predecessors had developed. The conflict continued through multiple escalations, including major operations in 2008, 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, before the current war that began in October 2023 and has killed more than 70,000 Palestinians, according to Gaza health authorities. The apartment buildings destroyed in Al-Daraj were eventually cleared and rebuilt, their replacement structures indistinguishable from the ones that had stood there before July 22, 2002. The families who died that night were buried according to Islamic tradition, mourned by relatives and communities who added their names to the lengthening lists of casualties produced by the conflict. The questions raised by the operation proved more difficult to erase. At the center of the debate lay a fundamental tension that no investigation or legal proceeding could resolve. Whether the targeted killing of a militant commander responsible for attacks that had killed numerous civilians could justify an operation that knowingly risked and ultimately caused the deaths of other civilians, including 7 children who had no connection to Hamas or to the conflict beyond the geographic misfortune of living in proximity to Israel's target. Israeli officials defended the operation by pointing to Shahada's operational record and the attacks he was believed to be planning, arguing that his elimination had likely prevented future Israeli deaths and therefore satisfied the proportionality requirements of international humanitarian law. Palestinian voices countered that no military objective could justify dropping a 1-ton bomb on a densely populated residential neighborhood in the middle of the night when families were sleeping, that the 7 children killed represented not collateral damage but predictable and therefore inexcusable consequences of the decision to proceed with the strike. Both positions could cite legal frameworks, precedents, and expert opinions that supported their conclusions, and neither could definitively prove the other wrong. What remained undisputed was the outcome. Salah Shehadeh was dead, along with his wife, his daughter, 7 children from neighboring families, and several other civilians whose presence in the blast radius had been anticipated but deemed acceptable. Hamas rebuilt its military wing under new leadership and continued operations that would kill hundreds more Israelis in subsequent years. Israel continued conducting targeted killings that would kill hundreds more Palestinians, some of them militants and some of them civilians who lived too close to the targets. The cycle persisted across decades, each side justifying its actions as necessary responses to the other's violence. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think targeted killings that risk significant civilian casualties can be justified when pursuing high-value terrorist targets? Share your thoughts in the comments.